Good morning, I'm Karl Griggs from CPC Finance, and today I'm here with Paul Cain from Ronald Fletcher Baker to discuss legal processes and matters.
Good morning, I'm Paul Cain, as Karl just said, from Ronald Fletcher Baker's solicitors. I'm an equity partner in the firm. We're a full service law firm, but with a keen interest in property. I run up the secured lending department, head up the secured lending department, but also deal with all property related matters such as commercial and residential conveyancing, secured lending, bridging lending, and development.
Paul, we've been working together for probably over 10 years now, and in that time everything's evolved. How are you finding the market at the moment?
Well, it's been a tricky few months, hasn't it? Of course, we had the boom over the last couple of years during the COVID and post-COVID, where we were both incredibly busy, weren't we?
Yeah.
It's kind of died down the last few months because obviously the mortgage interest rates have gone through the roof, and the market's kind of settled. As a result, I kind of found that the level of instructions have reduced. However, as a result, I think there's still a lot of opportunity out there for people who know property and developers and people who don't know property, because prices are coming down, and as a result, there's scope to get involved and start buying.
With the time we got now is particularly new people to the market. So obviously we arrange the finance and the mortgage offer, you do the legal side. Sometimes people run it parallel, sometimes they wait for the offer. What would you suggest?
Well, I mean, as it stands, I mean, we would not, I wouldn't feel comfortable a lot of the time exchanging contracts for a client without having a mortgage offer in place. However, as you know, Karl, recently it's taking some lenders incredible amount of time to get offers out, and even more so in the last few months. I mean, we had a really busy period, which means the lenders were really busy, and as a result, it was taking longer to get offers out. But now, I mean, their kind of due diligence process, as you'll know more than me, has kind of really increased, and it's taken them quite a while to get their offers out. So I think they need to run parallel. I mean, so you're not wasting any time, and sellers can get frustrated. I think it needs to run parallel. So I think that it's a good idea to instruct a broker and a solicitor at the same time.
Agreed.
So we can get to work at the same time, and hopefully by the time the offer has been issued, the legal process would have been quite far advanced.
With the delays in the mortgage offer side, how is that affecting the negotiations with the other side? Are people losing properties or going back on the market?
They can be. I mean, if you've got a seller, if you've agreed a deal and you've got a seller who wants a reasonably quick sale, for example, and you put a halt on the legal process until you get the mortgage offer out, you could be in a position where you're waiting 4-5 weeks without doing anything. And if a seller has instructed his own solicitor, which he will do, that's the first thing he will do once a sale has been agreed. If the solicitor's not had anything to do for 4 weeks because a buyer is waiting for their mortgage offer, then it's likely that they could potentially pull out.
One of the main changes that we've seen in the mortgage process is proof of funds and proof of wealth. Now, we have to get it for the lender, but then you also have to get it for your side.
Yeah.
So although sometimes the clients say, well, why do you need it if they're doing it? We're doing it for one reason, for the lending. You have to do it for your own side. How are you finding all of that at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite difficult. We're heavily regulated as solicitors, and we have to comply with the anti-money laundering regulations. So kind of our onboarding process is that when we are first instructed by a client, we have to, first of all, check their ID, so to make sure they are who they say they are, because there is a lot of fraud that goes around. Yeah. So we would have to, first of all, get their ID and 2 forms of proof of address. and we would typically want that certified either by us if we meet face to face, or if they're not local, another solicitor or the post office as well offer that service. And but more importantly, we would want to check their source of funds. So we have to make sure that the funds that we receive are not criminal proceeds, essentially. Yeah. So the way we do that is we ask for some documentary evidence as to where the funds that they're using to purchase the property have come from. Now, typically, you get sometimes you younger investors as well. They're borrowing money from parents or from third parties, and if that's the case, then we would also need to get the ID of that third party and have a paper trail of where that money's come from. So sometimes it can seem like we're prying, but it's something, unfortunately, we cannot avoid. We're bound by those regulations. So we would need to get things like bank statements showing if the money's come from savings, the build-up of those funds, or pay slips if it's from employment, or if it's from a refinance of another property, the completion statement, as well as the bank statement showing the funds going into that bank account.
I think we touched on earlier, before we started filming, you get stuff like winning the lottery and you get a payment. There's always a paper trail.
Yeah.
One of the growing areas for deposit that we're finding is investor loans.
Right.
So how do you cover that off?
Well, again, if it's investor loans, so you mean loans from a third party, essentially?
Yeah, behind the mortgage lender.
Behind the mortgage lender. So, again, we would need the paper trail evidence. So we'd need to find out who that investor is, find out where their source of funds come from. So we'd need their bank statements, for example, and we need to certify their ID and find out who they are. The problem is a lot of lenders don't necessarily like that situation, but there's things you can do to alleviate their concerns. We would, first of all, a lender would want to make sure, so what can happen, and that person who's lent the money has an interest in the property.
Yeah.
They automatically have an interest in the property because they've contributed towards the purchase price. So lenders would want to make sure that they have priority over that interest this third party has. So we can enter into various types of deed or agreements, like a deed of priority or a deed of subordination, to make sure that the lender has priority. That's the first thing. And secondly, we can have what's called a letter of gift or a deed of gift. So if it's an investor, you wouldn't typically get that because someone would essentially give up their rights to the property.
But also, you have to disclose the agreement, if there is one, to the lender, and that can affect their decision as well.
So if you're using a broker who hasn't done their job properly, which wouldn't be you, Karl, of course.
Thank you.
If you're using a broker who hasn't done their job properly, then sometimes they can apply to get the loan and they haven't told the lender where the money's coming from. And then if we find out in the conveyancing process that money's come from a third party, we would have to disclose that to the lender.
So again, it's better off disclosing everything up front.
Yes.
Because also from the broking side, we then know what lenders accept investors' agreements. Some don't.
Yeah.
And that way it makes it a lot smoother process.
Yeah.
Talk about smoother process. One of the big areas where people buy properties, auction finance.
Yeah.
Auction properties, sorry.
Right.
So is there any tips that you would suggest? Because, you could be a 4 to 6 week period of completion, which, as you said, with mortgages, can be a delay.
Yeah.
That is I would say probably 80% of finance on auction will be on a bridge.
Yeah.
Is there a different process, or is there things that you would suggest?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's kind of 4 key stages in the conveyancing process, which is, your pre-exchange, exchange, completion, post-completion. So the pre-exchange part of the process is essentially when a solicitor will do all the due diligence on the property, raise inquiries with the seller's solicitors. What an auction does is remove that part of the process, essentially, because it's being sold at auction, which means that you typically can't raise inquiries with the seller's solicitors. There'll be an auction pack that's loaded online, and the highest bidder on the day wins. So things to look out for the auction, as you said, it's so what happens? You'd exchange at auction, and then you'd have an agreed completion date of 6 weeks, or 4 to 6 weeks. So if you're buying with a mortgage, I would advise that you speak to a broker first before you bid at auction to make sure that you can get a kind of an agreement in principle in place to make sure that they're able to send you the funds, but also try and agree with the auctioneer that they're going to let you have access in between exchange and completion. Because once the hammer goes down and you've purchased at auction, unless you've got an agreement in place, the seller can refuse access.
Yeah.
Which if you haven't got access, then the mortgage can't send their valuer in. They can't do the valuation of the property, and you're going to have an issue. If they don't, if it's not a desktop valuation where there's not a physical inspection of the property. The other things that you should typically look out for at auction is there are sometimes hidden costs and fees. So they're quite tricky. They can be worded in quite a tricky way or a sneaky way, where the contract will say that on top of the purchase price, a buyer would have to pay the seller's legal fees and their agent's fees, which sometimes can be as much as 2% of the purchase price, which will massively increase the purchase price. So just make sure you look out for those.
I always compare it to like buying a second-hand car.
Yeah.
And you buy an as seen, and on the auction, once, as you say, once the hammer's gone down, if you've missed something, that's your problem.
Yeah, it is.
No one else's.
Yeah. So once you've exchanged contracts at auction, you typically fund 10% of the deposit, and if you do not complete on the completion date, you'll lose your 10% deposit, and you can be sued for any damages the seller suffers as a result. So you need to make sure that you instruct a solicitor to review the auction pack, to have a look through what's online, tell you what's missing, tell you if there's any issues with the property, so you can make an informed decision as to whether you want to proceed. And I would also give the solicitor some time, because sometimes I get a call the night before the auction.
I might know who you're referring to there.
The night before the auction, and ask me to look at an auction pack. So make sure you give, you know when the auction is, you've got a few weeks notice. Make sure you instruct a solicitor. And look, it's probably worth, a solicitor's probably charged between £500 and £1,000 to look at an auction pack plus VAT. It's worth paying that money.
If you lose your 10%,
exactly.
It's a little out there, and it's a business expense.
Yeah.
So just on that point of buying a property either at auction or normally, when you exchange, that's when you should put the buildings insurance on.
Correct. Yeah.
A lot of people come out and don't realise, particularly at auctions, I don't have to do it till completion.
No, I mean, the standard conditions, there's two different conditions of sale, the auction conditions and the standard conditions, and they can be varied. So sometimes, most of the time, it is the buyer's responsibility to, on exchange of contracts, insure the property. So if anything happens in between exchange and completion to the property, and it burns down, for example, or there's a huge, or it floods, as we've been seeing a lot recently, it's your responsibility. So if it's not insured, not only will you not get paid from the insurers, but the mortgage lender won't lend the money. If they're not going to lend on a property,
and again, you lose your money.
And again, you lose your 10% deposit, yeah.
And would you then be sued by the person selling as well?
Yeah.
Because they've lost their property?
So no, not necessarily. Not necessarily. You can't. So you're you're in breach of contract if you do not complete on the completion date. So it's your responsibility to insure the contract, to insure the property on exchange. So if you haven't, yes, you are in breach of contract.
Yeah.
So you can be sued for damages as a result of failing to insure.
Sort of leads on to another point about, obviously, buildings insurance, but we do a lot of HMO finance with you.
Yeah.
With our clients. And there's two areas on the HMO that keep popping up, or people get confused: planning and licensing.
Right. Yeah. It's a common error that people make. Yeah, I mean, HMOs are heavily regulated, and they're essentially, the government is trying to keep those tenants safe in the building. But so there's two ways they are regulated: it's planning and licensing, which are mutually exclusive things. So for a property to be converted to an HMO, as long as there's 6 people in the property, up to 6 people, it is permitted development.
Yeah.
So you can convert a normal house to an HMO without planning for up to 6 people. It depends, though. There are lots of local boroughs that have withdrawn those permitted development rights. Yeah. So you will need full planning to convert a normal house to an HMO in a particular area, for example. Any HMOs that are over 6 people, it's known as sui generis HMO. Which means it's in a use class of its own. That's the definition. So you will need full planning permission from the local authority.
And by doing the conversion and getting a licence, that doesn't cover off the planning.
So a licence is a different thing. So anyone can apply to the council for an HMO licence if the property is being used as an HMO. And as long as you satisfy certain criteria, such as things like having a fire risk assessment in place, the rooms are a certain size, you have emergency lighting, etc., the council will typically grant the HMO license. But if you've been granted an HMO license and you haven't got planning, you're still in breach of planning. So people tend to think the fact that they've got an HMO license in place means that they have a legal HMO, which they don't if they haven't got planning in place.
I think their view is, well, the council know about this.
Yeah, exactly. But they are different departments that don't communicate.
Yeah.
So
comment I was going to make. They don't talk to each other.
No, they don't. They don't communicate. So the fact you have an HMO license does not mean it's automatically a legal HMO. And again, you can have planning but lack of a license. So just because you've got planning in place for an HMO, and if you haven't got a license, it's still illegally let. Yeah. And there can be massive issues for an unlicensed HMO because it's a criminal offence. You can be fined up to £20,000. You can have a rent repayment order made, which means that the time it's been operating as an HMO, and that rent can be recovered and paid back to the tenants for the whole period that it's not had a license in place. So you have to make sure that you have both planning and a license in place. It's essential.
Because that sort of is the sort of things that you would check out on, going back to the packs, the auction stuff.
Yeah.
One of the other areas sometimes that comes up, and I don't know how this affects on the auction side, is if the property is unregistered.
Yeah.
Now, can that still go into auction?
Yeah, a property can still go into auction when it's unregistered. So all property now has to be registered at the land registry, but there's still some properties that were typically owned by elderly people that haven't been registered with the land registry. It makes our job a little bit more difficult because things like any restrictions in relation to the properties and covenants that affect the properties or rights that affect the properties or the property has the benefit of are normally set out at the land registry. Yeah. And we can see them on the official copy entries or the deeds that are attached to the official copy entries. With unregistered lands, sometimes you have documents that were drafted in the 1800s or early 1900s, and you have to read those documents. They can be kind of A3 size and very faint ink, and sometimes it's very difficult to kind of decipher what the property has the benefit of and what and burden of. So it makes our job a little bit more difficult, but it can still be sold at auction and it can still be sold, yeah.
And there is, on occasions, where some of those documents are missing because they go back 100 odd years.
Yeah, so if those documents are missing, there's certain things we can do to kind of alleviate any risk, things like indemnity policy. So if there are documents missing that contain deeds and covenants, then we can try and get an unknown covenant indemnity policy, which is insurance in the event that somebody comes forward and says, you can't use this property for a certain way. But the other thing that to point out as well, if you can't show who the owner was, and there's no documents showing the paper trail of ownership or the chain of ownership, sometimes you can only register the property as what's known as possessory title, so not title absolute. Yeah. So when it's possessory title, a lot of lenders don't like that. So
sort of notifying them that there isn't a full trail.
Yeah, it's notifying the land registry that it's not a full trail, and somebody can kind of come forward potentially and claim that this property belongs to them. Again, you can get insurance to cover that as well.
Mm-hmm. So one of our problems as a mortgage broker, and I don't include you in the next bit I'm going to say, is that people think that our job is just to get the mortgage offer. And sometimes people get the mortgage offer and they have no more contact till completion. What we do is that we like to chase through, get the deal, because as a company, our business, we don't get paid unless it completes. Yeah. So it's in our interest to do it, as well as get the clients their property. How do you find working with brokers and that? Because sometimes we can help chase it when you send stuff to the lenders as well, because as you quite rightly said earlier in the process, they're behind and they're slow. So they do need chasing, but it's not always your job to do that.
No, I mean, I think it massively helps for a broker to be involved in the conveyancing process. We've worked together, as you said, for a long time, and it's nice that we keep each other copied into emails, etc. Especially with bridging and kind of development finance, because it's not kind of you just get the offer and you let the solicitor do their conveyancing. Yeah. With bridging and development finance, you being heavily involved really carries some weight, especially for the lender. If the lender solicitors are being slow, for example, typically the broker has the relationship with the lender directly and can kind of try and assist in moving the process along.
Because one of the other things is also they refer a lot to their client, i.e. the bank.
Yeah.
And that can be where it slows down as well, and you wouldn't have a contact with
No,
them.
exactly. I don't have a direct contact with a bank. When I'm writing to the bank, it's kind of to a general email address, an admin email address, whereas the broker has a direct contact with their relationship manager at the bank, and as a result, can get things done quicker.
Yeah.
So if we need to, for example, we were discussing earlier the fact there's an investor, a third-party investor. If I need to contact the bank to say, look, this is the position, there's a third-party investor, they can take sometimes weeks to respond, whereas someone like you, Karl, would be able to contact the bank directly and could get a response in a day.
Because I think sometimes also we've got information that helps speed it up, and one of the examples of that is the valuation report.
Yeah.
Because we'll send it over to you,
Exactly.
get the ball processing, because that can raise questions as well.
Yeah. So sometimes we're not privy to the valuation. A valuation is done for the lender. It's not for the buyer. It's not for us. But you get that information. We wouldn't normally see that, but sometimes if you send that to me, I can look through it and check whether there's any issues and kind of anticipate any issues that the lender solicitor is going to come up with.
Again, like the planning and licensing that we spoke about. That's great. Okay, so that finishes our chat today. But if you want to get in touch with Paul, and of course we would highly recommend that you use him as a solicitor working with us. His contact details will be shown. Be sure to like, share and subscribe, as our next guest is Cyril Thomas on mentoring.